Our time is 7 minutes past 8 o'clock. Good evening from me, Nthakoana, Ngatane. And if you've just joined us, welcome to Inside Eyewitness News on 702 and Cape Talk, brought to you by your trusted EWN news team every Sunday from 7 to 9 p.m. And if you've just joined us again, today on this roundtable discussion, which is what we do every second hour of the show, we are looking at the results of the US elections and what they mean for Africa, if anything. I'm joined by South African academic and celebrated author Zakes Mda, who's based out in Ohio in the US, trade expert, former CEO of the Lesotho National Development Corporation, former trade minister, and former WTO advisor Joshua Setipa, who is joining us from Istanbul, Turkey, and the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Alan Mukoki, who is with me here in Johannesburg. Now, if you would like to see them, go to the EWN or Eyewitness News Facebook page. That's where you will find us. But it's official. Joe Biden is the president-elect and Kamala Harris is the deputy president-elect of the US. But President Donald Trump is yet to concede defeat, but we cannot ignore the messages from world leaders who have already congratulated Biden. They include UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Canada President Justin Trudeau. From the African continent, AU Chair and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission Musa Faki Mahamat, Nigeria President Muhammadu Buhari, and Ethiopia Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. These are the people who have already acknowledged Joe Biden's victory in the US. Their messages essentially say they are ready to work with Biden. So clearly they believe that he is a US president who will be pro-multilateralism. So, Ngatane Mda, let me start with you. You have been in the US for a while. You've heard the use of the word relief. I'm sure you've heard it in the US, we've heard it around the world to describe this result. Are you feeling it where you are? Ngatane Mda, are you with us?
Oh dear. Okay.
Let me make sure my guests are with me. Ngatane Mda, you're with me, right?
I've unmuted myself now.
Thank you very much. Ntate Joshua Setipa, you're with me, right?
I am here. Thank you very much.
Right. Ntate Alan Mukoki, you're with me, right?
Yes, I'm here.
Right.
Thank you.
Ntate Mda, I wanted to start with you to say, yes, you are in the US. We've had use of the word relief to describe this outcome of the US elections. Are you feeling it out there in Ohio?
Oh, yes, definitely. I am feeling it very, very much as a South African who's also a Mosotho, who has lived in in America for 39 years. I have a family here. I have children. I have, who have their lives here. And whatever decisions that are made by the American government, be it Trump or Biden or those who came before, affect us directly. It can be, healthcare. It can be, education, for instance, study loans and things like that. All those things affect my family in practical and material ways. And therefore, for me, Trump was not just theory. He was somebody who affected my life and the life of my children and my grandchildren.
As an immigrant, but there are some Africans
not just as an immigrant, as somebody who lives here, who's an American citizen, who votes here, who is an immigrant.
Yes.
But
Now, some Africans believe that the US is a country with very strong institutions and policies, and those are people who are skeptical that Donald Trump, had any effect. They believe that it is the system and that's the way it is. Donald Trump just brought it out. What do you say to that?
Well, they are both right and wrong, because there are those issues that America and Americans regard as of the American interest.
Right.
This means that whether it is Biden or Trump or what, there won't be much change, especially in as far as foreign policy is concerned.
Right.
Bombs will continue to rain on the children of Yemen, whether it is Trump or Biden, that will continue.
Right.
Because
Right.
they view that as an American interest.
Right.
But there are other things, specific things. For instance, Mr. Trump withdrew from the World Health Organization,
Right.
withdrew from the Paris Accord.
Right.
And those things affect not only America and Americans, they affect the whole world and they affect Africa a lot as well. So there are those things which are systematic, which are part of what and who what America is, but there are those things that are specifically Trumpian.
Right.
That will change because Trump is no longer there.
Right. Setipa, let me bring you in. You've been on both sides of the street when it comes to dealing with the United States, both walking the corridors as a trade minister, negotiating agreements with the US for your country, but also alongside Pascal Lamy, who was Director General, as an advisor. You were the referees, or the WTO is expected to be the referees of free and fair trade in the world. In your experience, does it matter who is president of the US?
Thank you very much. Yes, it does matter who is the president in the US, but we should also remember that the US is unique in the sense that it is probably the only country where trade policy authority lies in the hands of the legislature, not the administration. So the authority to conclude and sign trade agreements rests with Congress. It does not rest with the administration. Nonetheless, the direction of US trade policy is influenced by the administration in place. Now, when it comes to Africa in particular, I think the approach or the angle from which we should assess the unfolding situation is first to look at what are Africa's interests when it comes to international trade, when it comes to trade with the US. And the number one priority for Africa is a full implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Right. Now, with that in mind, let us look at how over the last 20 years or so, trade between Africa and the US has been managed. It has primarily taken place within the framework of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which has been extended up to 2025. Now, the process of already considering a successor to AGOA, moving towards a more reciprocal trade relationship, started way before President Trump was in office. It started actually during the President Obama's time in office. The US made it very clear that it was interested in moving away from the development based or development assistance based model of a trade relationship towards a more reciprocal trade relationship where the US will seek concessions from Africa in exchange for continued enhanced market access. Following the example set by the EU and Africa. Remember, the EU and Africa negotiated a reciprocal trade relationship, which saw the EU conclude free trade agreements with Africa along the regional economic communities. So the question for Africa today should be, will the new administration support Africa's trade priority, which is the full implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which seeks to increase intra-Africa trade? Any administration or any trading partner that undermines that should, in the eyes of Africa, be viewed with skepticism. Now, any process that strengthens that objective should be welcome. The second phase or the second aspect would be the African position and Africa's interest in the multilateral trading system. Now, the US is part of the WTO, just like the 34 African countries that are in the WTO. The WTO is an insurance policy for Africa. It's an insurance policy because it levels the playing field. It allows for countries as small as Lesotho and as big as Nigeria to sit across the table from the US and across the table from Japan and across the table from the EU and China, and be able to say, this is how we want the system to benefit us, and this is what the rules we want and how they should be applied. If the WTO is weakened, that insurance policy goes away, then it becomes the survival of the fittest. The rules of the jungle then come into play, which means that the strongest will survive. So Africa has an interest in working with the new administration to ensure that the multilateral trading system, the WTO, is strengthened. The reform process that the current US administration has been calling for is also very important for Africa. So Africa should actively be part of that reform process. And that includes even who gets to lead the WTO, which is another important issue that Africa, particularly at this juncture, given the latest developments, has a very direct interest in. But the long and short of it, our consideration of how Africa should interact with the new administration should be first understanding and reconfirming that Africa's trade priorities relate to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and everything else has to align with that, including its relations with the US.
You talk about the WTO being a place where all states, member states, are equal. And of course, we know this because recently there's a race that's going on, and we have two candidates. One is from Africa and one is from South Korea. And the US decided to use that power that it has as a single vote to probably stop the appointment of the African candidate, because it knows that if as a single country it says no for now, and it prefers South Korea, that means that that appointment won't go ahead. So how isn't the US going to continue to play, or to at least do what it's doing inside of the WTO?
The WTO decision-making process is quite complex because, one, the agreement, the agreement establishing the WTO allows or provides for decision-making by voting in the worst-case scenario when consensus is not possible. But to date, decision-making in the WTO is by consensus, which means that for a decision to hold, every single member of the WTO should be able to live with that decision.
And
any objection?
All other member states have now said that they are behind the African.
All other member states except the US. So that means that there is no consensus. That is the net effect of that. Now, of course, member states have the option of going exercising the vote option, which also has significant implications, and which is why it has never been used up to date. Decisions have always been taken eventually by consensus. Now, it would be interesting to see whether with the new administration that is coming into office, there will be changes or there will be a shift in that position. But one thing we should not forget is that the current administration is in place until the 19th of January.
Yes.
And the plan is to have the new Director General of the WTO formally confirmed by the General Council of the WTO before the December break, which means that
it's quite likely that the position of the US will remain.
Which means that Africa, being the ones with the candidate that is most favored to lead the WTO, have a direct interest in continuing to engage with the current administration and understanding why the objections are and seeing whether those objections can be accommodated. It would also be, pardon?
Yeah, we'll come back to the significance of having an African candidate in the WTO. Let me bring in Alan. Alan, South Africa is one of the two biggest economies on the continent. It's also the chair of the AU in the year that the free trade area is coming to life. Does it matter to you as the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry that Joe Biden and not Donald Trump will be president in January? Alan, you've muted yourself. Please unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Well, I'm saying that it's a yes and a no answer. I think that in the final analysis, the proof is in the pudding, as we say, because it depends what it is that Biden has in mind. You know, in the final analysis, foreign policy supported by trade policy is always going to be a function of interest, of special interest, or self-interest of any particular country. So I don't think that Joe Biden is necessarily there taking over the American presidency because he's necessarily going to support Africa. I think that where the interests of Africa and those of America, they are aligned, you can actually expect the support. But where the interests of Africa are supposedly more important and the American interests should be subordinated, you can expect either a Democratic-led presidency or a Republican-led presidency to take a decision that is always going to be in favor of America. So with Americans, it's very simple. It's always America first. So they put their country first and then everybody else comes next. So to that extent, yes, indeed, we do think that purely because of the eccentricism of the incumbent president, Donald Trump, that he has tended to be very different as a person in terms of his own personality, his character, and tended to be much more self-centered in respect of protecting the interests of the United States in his own mind, even though he will damage international relationships. We can only assume that with Biden coming in, there will be a much more sober approach in respect of how to resolve the issues that still linger from a difference point of view.
In the event that Joe Biden, as you say, looks at Africa differently, what is it that you as Saki are hoping to make quick wins?
Well, I think that quite clearly, as the previous speaker was speaking, in resolving the issue around the international trade agreement, whether it's AGOA or any of its successor type agreements. And I think that the issue that was raised clearly is that what the US had tended to move into, instead of looking at us as a developing economy that is trying to become a developed economy, as we keep saying, in the last 100 years, there are less than 8 non-Western countries that have moved from developing to developed economies. And amongst those, you count Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the old Hong Kong, Israel, Australia, Russia, Singapore. And I think that for South Africa, in respect of the challenges that we're facing, especially around unemployment, poverty and inequality, we don't necessarily stand a chance other than to do the types of things that can galvanize our people and our energies to create this South Africa that becomes a developed economy. And many people are talking about China and Brazil probably will enter that esteemed league of those countries probably in the next 10 years. So we need to be able to do those things on our side. And therefore, I'm saying this point very clearly, because if you look at those Asian tigers like Taiwan and South Korea, they were assisted in the main by having similar preferential trade agreements with the United States and to some extent with Europe. So these trade agreements where you get preference because you're a developing economy are very much material and very significant, because they can determine whether your ability to get to that developed state is going to be speeded or it is not going to be speeded. So to that extent, therefore, we hope that with a Biden presidency, perhaps this matter can be brought back into the discussion that says, however, these are developing economies, so therefore they do need to get that level of assistance in a way that is competent, of course, and not in a way in which it's going to be disadvantageous to the American economic system. We work and we speak a lot to the American Chamber of Commerce, and they tend to be very much sectarian because they are the ones who influence the politicians, those strong PACs, as they call them in Washington, DC, the political action committees, are strongly influenced by the chambers of commerce in each and every town, and they will drive sectarian interests, whether it's in agri, whether it's in auto, whether it's in oil and gas, and a whole range of other areas. So we need to be able to be conscious of the fact that when the politicians eventually take a decision, it is because they themselves are being influenced below their level of operation by the sectarian interest or the local interest that a specific industry is actually struggling with or would like articulated much more firmly. However, but we hope that with Biden, things would be a lot more better in dealing with this issue of developing to developed economy.
Alan, I want to come back and talk about those industries and the specific sectors, and also agreements similar to the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, and how it's, in my view at least, is not being used optimally by African countries. It's 27 minutes past 8 o'clock. Let me just take a few of our callers so that they become part of our conversation. Sifudi in Randfontein, you say we cannot ignore the 70 million that voted for Trump.
Good evening, Nthakoana.
Good evening, Sifudi.
The constituency, more than 70 million that voted for Trump,
True,
cannot be sneezed at.
true.
The issue that they are raising, anti-globalization, that never benefited them and also never benefited the globalization that also never benefited Africa, will remain. That issue will remain. The issue of immigration will also remain. Trump was helped largely Biden was likely helped by Trump mishandling of COVID. Hindsight dictates that if he had handled it differently, we would be talking another story. Anti-immigration, anti-globalization, that issue will remain in America as it is in Britain, and there's no turning back. And if Biden doesn't handle it correctly, he'll also be a one-term president. Good evening to you.
Thank you, Sifudi. And I think that's what I said earlier on, that there are those who believe that Trump is actually what America is. Now, Phil Waterkloof in Pretoria, you say Joe Biden's victory will benefit Africa. How so?
Yes, good evening and your learned guest. You know, the Biden's victory is going to reverse the old thinking of the American leadership that Africa is a learning organization. We need to establish what is called the interdependence, not dependence, relationships between the Africa and America. You know, there's this thing, the likely Secretary of State, Susan Rice, PhD, who is a semi-Africa. Her PhD is on Zimbabwe. It can help to deal with the strictures of sanctions that we all need to assist Zimbabwe and to help integrate Africa into the collaboration, leapfrogging, and upping up the manufacturing trade with America. And I think that is my contribution, that I think we'll see a better Africa relationship with one under Joe Biden. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Phil. But Phil brings in quite a contentious issue in the sense that while the African Union is behind the removal of sanctions against Zimbabwe and South Sudan, for instance, Zimbabwe in particular is being criticized heavily, at least internally, for its abuse of human rights and corruption in that country. So maybe that's an issue for another day altogether. Let's come back to the agreements that the US signs with African countries. Top of them is the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. Nthakoana, you were part of negotiations, at least for Lesotho when you were trade minister, where that country needed AGOA to be extended. You also were part of negotiations for the Millennium Challenge Compact that Lesotho is still working on with the United States of America. But Lesotho on its own has not taken advantage of, I don't even know if it's 1% or 10% of what it can export to the United States. So what should African countries be doing to ensure that not only do they sign the agreements, but that they take advantage of them when they're in place?
Well, thank you very much. You're absolutely correct that considering the scope of the product scope or coverage of AGOA, Africa collectively has not fully exploited that potential. AGOA covers over 6,500 tariff lines, which means that looking at the current export profile, there are a few countries that you can say have, to a certain extent, exploited AGOA. If you remove those petroleum exporting countries, then you begin to see a much more clearer picture of the profile of exports under AGOA. If you take Lesotho, for example, AGOA directly provides or covers jobs or has created jobs in the apparel sector, around 40,000 jobs. And of course, if you add service providers to that, then the number goes up. South Africa has benefited from AGOA by through exports of primarily agricultural products, wines, citrus, and this represents a significant portion, for example, of South African wine exports, which if AGOA was to, the preferential market access under AGOA was to go, a significant number of jobs would also be at stake. It is also important to note that up to date, Africa has had a trade surplus with the US. Of course, it's been shrinking. If you look at its highest level in 2008, it stood at around 85 billion. Now it's shrunk significantly, but it is still a trade surplus, and that is one of the reasons why I believe the current administration was at pains to push for a more, in their view, a more reciprocal trade relationship. When we negotiated the extension of AGOA in 2015, which we understood at that time at least that it was the last extension, it was made very clear to Africans that the US wants a reciprocal agreement. It wants enhanced market access in Africa for its exports in exchange for continued market access. Now, as Africa, what we need to be focused on is the current approach that the US is adopted. Does it support and strengthen our #1 trade priority, which is the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? We have already seen negotiations for a bilateral trade agreement start with one country in Africa, Kenya. Now, that should give us a sense of how the US is approaching this. There might be changes in emphasis and nuances with the new administration, but overall, my expectation is that the US trade policy approach to Africa is not going to change that much because, as I mentioned, the current direction did not start with the current administration. It actually started with the administration of President Obama. And I do not see that changing because there's a new president in Washington. What will change perhaps will be the support of the US for multilateral approaches in certain aspects. And as I think as Professor Mda noted, the expectation is that the US will re-engage with the Paris process, will join the Paris conference. We expect the US to re-engage with the WHO. And the expectation from the trade community is that the US will adopt a much more conciliatory approach when it comes to the reform of the WTO, and that perhaps could stabilize a bit the global trading environment as we see it today. But Alan, as far as the overall structure of US engagement with Africa on trade, that will not change. But I also think that it is for Africa to engage the US. It is not for Africa to wait for the new administration to outline its interests and how it wants to engage Africa. We should approach the new administration and say, these are our priorities, and our priority #1, priority #2, priority #3, priority #4, and #5 is African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Right.
Everything else has to fit in that. Our bilateral trade relations with our strategic partners have to be supportive of that continental priority, because anything that undermines that, and this also, and I want to emphasize this, all the bilateral trade agreements that African countries and their trading partners are also pursuing, not just with the US, as long as they contribute towards the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, then they should be welcome. But anything that could undermine this process will have to be approached very careful, because it will then set Africa back. And one, just to highlight the situation of Africa when it comes to intra-regional trade. If you look at the fact that when you compare Africa to other regions, intra-Africa trade stands at 17%, compared to 59% in Asia, 69% in Europe, and 31% in North America, which means that Africa still has a long way to catch up with the rest of the world in terms of ensuring that trade between ourselves is sustainable and it grows, which will open up opportunities for industrialization. And Africa, the other important aspect is that Africa's demographic makeup has changed. So what we are seeing is that Africa, FDI, the type of FDI that flows into Africa is slowly shifting away from resource-seeking investments to market-seeking investments. So Africa is now seen as a big market, given that over 60% of the population is under 30. Right. So Alan, it is a big market.
Alan, why has South Africa not taken up all of the opportunities, at least under AGOA? Let's start there. I mean, as Joshua says, there are more than 6,000 lines, and yet African countries are not optimally using those opportunities to export duty-free to the United States of America. And what industries or sectors, as Joshua is saying, what industries do you think and sectors do you think South Africa should almost immediately be talking to the new administration that's coming in about?
Well, you know, I think that one of the fundamental errors that we made when the new government came in, I suspect, in a sense, wanting to prove to people that the ANC government was not going to be reckless in choosing perhaps maybe negative economic policies, trade policies, and this and that and the other. We tended to get a lot more closer to what many people refer to as the so-called Washington consensus. And these are policies generally derived way back in the 80s to deal with the Latin American debt crisis, largely by the World Bank, IMF to some extent, as well as the United States Secretary Treasury. So you have that situation where these policies were almost looked at as the mantra of how you ought to be able to run your government. And I'm making this point very decidedly because I'm saying, if you look at them, you have things like fiscal policy discipline, where you are asked that there should be an avoidance of large deficits relative to GDP. You've got things there like tax reform. The interest rates must be competitive. There must be trade liberalization. This is one of the big key issues that were almost being imposed on South Africa. And we almost imbibed that without having thought very clearly that at the time that we're going for trade liberalization, we're going to deregulate, we're going to open up our markets. We had not anticipated the fact that some Asian, and in particular, most people complain about China, for instance, and other countries, started to dump their goods into the South African market, and that decimated effectively the manufacturing and industrialization program in South Africa at the time, and we haven't actually really recovered from that. So instead of us focusing on rebuilding that level of industrialization and manufacturing and building a much more clearer and sustainable program around getting our minerals to be beneficiated, we actually chose rather to focus largely on the two primary sectors, which is agri and mining, where we dig things from the ground and we actually export them away without adding any more value to those particular goods and products. And that killed our market effectively in respect of us becoming strong. In foreign policy, again, for you to be respected in international affairs, you either need to be very rich or you need to be dangerous. So you must be either armed to the teeth with atom bombs and all sorts of things, or you need to be really wealthy, that people have things that they want from you and they have to respect you, such as the Gulf, maybe countries, because everyone knows there's a lot of oil there. India is respected because everyone knows that they have the A-bomb. We decided to dismantle our own A-bomb without anyone asking us to do so, and we lost some kind of leverage. So where we are in respect of what we didn't do is that we also did not invest in people. Investment follows people. We as business ourselves made a fundamental error in looking at the idea of transformation as a garage buy. You know, we always say that people don't buy a rented car.
Yeah.
So if you look at the level of business leadership and the narrative that had been driven since 1994, we tended from a leadership point of view as business itself tended to want to oppose things like transformation. Yet it is that very same transformation today that we know would have built this economy in a way in which we would never have imagined. Because if you release the level of resources, the skill sets, and the rising incomes in these markets that are growing and emerging in South Africa amongst women, amongst people who are Black, amongst the youth, you know that we end up with a standard bank that is 10 times its size just in the domestic market alone. That enables you capital formation, that enables that level of capital formation because people buy goods and they buy services, they've got disposable income, they pay more tax, so the revenue authorities receive more tax, and you're able to drive that investment back into the development or development of infrastructure in the power sector, in the rail and logistics sector, in the blue economy sector, in the telecommunications sector. Because if you don't do that level of investment domestically, you will not get an opportunity to drive your own capacity and capability to attract the right level of investment that comes with skills that will then enable your industries and your manufacturing environments to actually grow. So I'm saying that because we did not take the right policy choices, especially around the idea of how we wanted to run the economics and around how we wanted to build up the skill set, whether in the private as well as the public sector, that we excluded so many millions of our own people from earning decent and rising incomes so that they were not participants in the economy of South Africa. The economy of South Africa, had we driven transformation properly, we should be at least 3 times the size of this particular economy. Taiwan is a case in point, a country only formed in 1949, right? And they had nothing when they started. Way, way, way after South Africa came into being. Yet their economy is now 3.5 times bigger than the size of South African economy, 4% unemployment, no natural resources, but they relied on skills, they relied on building the human capital issue. So I'm saying that therefore, these are the choices that we had. We needed to fix the education system. We needed to drive the infrastructure by making sure that we can attract the right level of revenue that comes into the fiscus, but you can only do that because these things sometimes are chicken and egg by ensuring that you get so many of your people in employment because they've got the skills and that you are giving them opportunities, including the area of women in particular, because that's one of our biggest opportunities to grow and drive this economy in a way that is sustainable over a long period of time. And I think that if we then were able to do that, to drive the manufacturing and to substitute quite a number of the imports, because we're still importing a lot of things that we ought not to be actually importing. So you look at all these iPhones and Samsung phones that we're using, most of those chips are actually made in Asia, in Taiwan as well as in South Korea. There's zero reason why those things cannot be made here when we are one of the biggest population groups in Africa, 1.2 billion people or somewhere thereabouts. So these are the smart choices that we ought to be able to take to say we produce the platinum and platinum-based minerals in South Africa and in the region. Why are we not driving a lot of the activity around the auto sector? For instance, if you look at that AGOA that we're speaking about earlier on, and you look at the auto sector, we still make the Mercedes cars and the BMWs and the Ford motors. We export them into the United States, yet 60 to 65% of the inputs that go into those cars are things that are not being made in South Africa. Yet 80% plus of the minerals that are required to make those particular inputs into the autos, the minerals actually come from South Africa. So what we're doing, we're exporting the raw product into overseas markets, and then we import the very same auto parts that we get into these cars. So those are some of the areas to answer your question in terms of where are the opportunities in the auto sector, massive opportunities, big job creation opportunities in the mining sector around beneficiation of our minerals, as well as in the agri sector, especially in the area of making sure that we're smart around our investment, not only in South Africa, but in Africa, because there are still billions, hundreds of billions of money that is not being invested in South Africa, that's sitting in the vaults in South Africa here. And that money needs to be deployed in the rest of Africa. There is no place that is as rich in terms of its soils, in terms of its opportunity for water than the Great Lakes region and the South Sudan in particular. So we need to be very smart and stop being Afro-pessimistic and deploy the capital, the technology, because South African agri sector is one of the most advanced in the world. But we're not going to be able to do that by focusing only on South Africa. South African businesses can only grow by investing in the rest of Africa and taking advantage of those opportunities. When we do that, we become wealthy, and then we become respected. And people like the United States, they look at us in a way that is different, not in a way where they think we're bringing their begging bowl mentality, and we try to negotiate a deal that is only beneficial to ourselves and not to them. We need to be treated as equal partners.
I think which is why Joshua is saying that intra-Africa trade is still at 17%. But
absolutely.
And I want to come back to the issue of beneficiation, because it speaks also to the fact that developed nations still offer subsidies to their agricultural sectors. But let me bring in Mda. Mda, please answer Alan's issue about education, because you are out there and you see what Africa produces that is not reaching US shores, but also you see knowledge that is not being utilized for Africa benefit.
Yes. Well, before I address that, so that we make this into a discussion,
yes,
I want to go back to some points that that were raised by Zakes Setipa, for instance.
Yes.
Insofar as, because you see, I'm more interested in the question you invited me for here, namely what the distinctions will be between the old, well, which is not old, the about to be old and
the
and the new,
outgoing and the incoming.
Yes, and Zakes Setipa rightly points out that World Trade Agreements rest with Congress rather than with other branches.
Right.
But in fact, the presidency has, especially when it's Trump, who did not obey or was not restricted, by existing protocols and practices, and who would do whatever he felt like doing, such as withdrawing. I mean, in any other situation, to withdraw from the World Health Organization, that would have been Congress who does that. But he's able to do things like that. So it is clear to me that if it was Trump's second term, there would have been no renewal of AGOA in 2025.
Right.
Because his government, as whose mantra is America first.
Yes.
And an isolationist government has that antipathy to anything which reeks of multilateralism.
Yes.
He is much more interested in having specific bilateral relations with specific countries, so-called strategic partners, so that he's able to keep tight rein on them, particularly on their foreign policy.
Right.
So that was the practice, irrespective of whether Congress liked that or not. And indeed, you see, there are chances now that AGOA or another, agreement, which is an improvement on AGOA in 2025, has the opportunity to be renewed.
Right.
In other instances, we would have been sure that it would not have been renewed because it worked against the interests of the bilateral tunnel vision of the Trump regime of the time.
Right.
Now, coming back to your question, which is on education.
Yeah.
Well, you see, the problem with us in Africa we got steeped in the aid culture. And when I talk of aid here, I'm not talking, for instance, of humanitarian aid, which will always be necessary.
Yeah.
I'm not even talking of technical assistance,
Yes.
which is necessary, or perhaps the kind of aid that is channeled directly to NGOs.
Mm.
I'm talking of the kind of aid that some countries in Africa actually used to top up their fiscus.
Yeah.
That has been very dangerous for us in Africa because
Right.
it created a dependency mentality, which continues up to this day. In fact, a lot of our economies were killed by that kind of aid. You see, because we always expected that, oh, the masters will give us this. You see, which is different, of course, from trade and the trade arrangements that we have been talking about here. I'm now talking about aid.
Right.
So even our education system then in many African countries was actually destroyed by that aid mentality, by that dependency mentality.
Right.
That is why also you find that a lot of the people, your brains, the brain drain that they talk about, people have to go and work outside. Why am I not a professor in South Africa now? I was there, a professor there. It's very simple. It's very simple. I am 72 years old. In South Africa, I can only be employed until I'm 65.
Right.
Here, I can work until I'm 200 years old, which is what I'll be doing. You see,
right.
I'm doing that now. I'm a professor at 2 universities, Johns Hopkins and elsewhere.
Yes.
Because they are looking at my capability, at my output as a scholar.
Right.
Not at my age, but at home, 65, you have to go.
Right.
If you are employed, if you are employed, is on some contract, and that university must look for funds elsewhere in order to pay you on some short term, because at 65 you are supposed to go and die.
Right.
You see that?
I want to go back to your position on trade agreements, particularly AGOA. You're disagreeing with Joshua, and I want to hear what he has to say in terms of the possibility that a new administration can bring about a renewed arrangement or different arrangement that may even replace AGOA. What do you say, Joshua?
One thing that we should, and I agree with what Professor Mda has outlined, but one thing that we need to remember is that AGOA was first and foremost a development or development assistance-based trade arrangement. The political and economic objective was to help Africa use trade to drive its development.
Right.
AGOA is a unilateral trade provision, which means that it can be withdrawn at the will of the US without having to explain itself to the beneficiaries. And we've seen how disruptive that is. Look at the case of Rwanda today.
Yeah.
The US withdrew AGOA provisions for Rwanda. It did the same thing for a number of other countries. Swaziland, Eswatini is one of them. It did the same, I think, with Sudan. It excluded Sudan and others. So for predictability and for minimizing disruptions to our economic development, we need reciprocal trade arrangements. And my case is, or the point I would like to emphasize is, it's in Africa's interest to transition towards a reciprocal agreement which has rights and obligations for both parties, so that one party does not wake up tomorrow because it does not like the new president who has been elected and decides to withdraw that with the loss of thousands of jobs. If you remember the case of Madagascar, when Madagascar was cut out of AGOA, it moved from being the largest export of clothing to the US market to being number 5 or number 6, with thousands and thousands of jobs lost, with serious economic and social implications. So for predictability, to be able to attract the level of investments that would accompany the market access that trade arrangement with the US would bring, it has to be premised on something more predictable than a unilateral instrument, which is what the current AGOA arrangement is. So the interest of Africa, and we've seen also that with other bilateral arrangements with other trading partners, with the EU as an example, the shift from the Lome framework in the EU brought about transparency. It brought about predictability in Africa's market access into the EU. What Africa should be negotiating with the US now is, how does the transition support the regional integration priorities of Africa? And the point that was made by Nthakoana Mukoki relating to the fact that Africa imports most products which are actually manufactured out of using inputs from Africa.
Material,
it's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Materials, it's true. And if you look at what the priorities of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement are, it is to create value chains across the continent, which would mean that what is mined in the DRC is processed in South Africa, it is manufactured in Kenya, it is assembled in Mauritius, and therefore that is what would strengthen Africa's own economic resilience. As long as yes.
Yes, I'm going to wrap up now. We're almost running out of time, but just quickly, Joshua, speak to the issue of, and literally in 30 seconds, the issue of subsidies and the impact that they have on this arrangement that we're talking about. And I'll ask Alan to do the same thing.
Still referring to the point that was made by Nthakoana Mukoki, if you look at the impact or the strength of the farm lobby in the US and its impact on Africa's agricultural sector, cotton is a very good example.
Yeah.
The continued subsidization, domestic subsidies on the cotton industry in the US has devastated African cotton farmers.
Right.
And
I'm going to leave you there. I'm going to leave you there.
And then just one point to conclude that.
Yes.
The failure to conclude the Doha round has meant that the world has missed an opportunity to bring those subsidies under control, under discipline, so that we could limit the impact on African exports. And that is just one product. We can talk about tomatoes, we can talk about other sectors, but the long and short of it is that domestic subsidies in the US continue to undermine farmers across the world, particularly in Africa.
Alan, how have subsidies been affecting farmers in South Africa exporting to the US?
Well, you know, in all fairness, everyone subsidizes. I mean, I think that South Africa itself may well say that we do not subsidize, but we do in one way or the other. In other words, when you give grants to the agri sector, when you make land much more cheaper, when you are enabling the farming community to have easier and quicker access to finance or financing instruments or insurances, it's still part of the same thing. But the more important issue is to make sure that we drive the level of competitiveness in the sectors that are actually generally affected by bringing in the technology, bringing in the skills, and make sure that we develop and bring much more quicker networks and connections that are important. If you look at
Thank
the US,
you very much.
A lot of the
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Alan Mukoki, South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Zakes Mda, based in Ohio, academic and author, Joshua Setipa, trade expert in Istanbul, Turkey. That was your Inside Eyewitness News this Sunday. I'm Nthakoana Ngatane. Join us back again on Sunday at 7 p.m.